Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you. It's a bit quiet, but and I have my
Yes,
volume
we
all the
can
way
hear.
up.
And how's this now? All right? Better? Pretty good?
Yeah, pretty good.
So, I'm going to, in a moment, I will share a screen with you all with a few sources. There are many topics that one can speak about with regards to Purim. Today, I want to address the fundamental question of how comes about, how a new day in the Jewish calendar enters into the Torah, into the halachic system. How do such things work, and do they happen in a smooth, seamless fashion, or is it perhaps frequently a question of some dissension and argument, at least at the beginning? So, without further ado, I'm going to I don't think I can share a screen with you. I think only the host can share a screen with you.
Achihud, you are able to allow him to do that.
Achihud, are you there?
Can
you please give me permission to share a screen?
Yeah, hold on.
Can I share the screen now?
I think so. Try it.
Very well, I shall indeed try. No, it says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Now try it.
Yes, that looks good. All right, can everyone now see a screen with some sources? Purim, Hazon, wa Te'uzal Hadesh B'Torah, the Purim paradigm, the vision and daring to innovate. Can you see that?
Yeah, I can see that.
Excellent. Very well. So we find in the Talmud Bavli, Megillah, Tav Zayin Amud Aleph, we find the following statement: Amarav Shemuel Bar Yehuda, Bat Tehila, Kava'u B'Shushan. Initially, Purim was only celebrated or enacted in or celebrated. It's not entirely clear how one should understand that term. In Shushan, in the capital city of the Persian Empire at that time. But eventually, Purim was accepted throughout the Jewish world. And there on the same daf we find the following statement. That is one beth in front of you on the sheet. Source sheet. Amar Rab Shemuel Bar Yehuda. Shalaha lahem Esther lahachamim. Esther Malka sent to the Hachamim. Apparently, this refers to the Hachamim at that time in Eretz Yisrael. Kiv'uni le'doroth. Literally, establish me or fix me or enact me for all generations. So in other words, as a permanent fixture in Torah Judaism. There should not be an event that is celebrated just now, just this year, or just next year, when the memory is still fresh, but rather it should be celebrated for all time. Rashi explains there, Kiva'oni Yom Tov Ulikriya. To make this into a special day, Yom Tov, a day of celebration, of feasting, and a day of reading, the Megillah, that is to say. How did the Hachamim respond? Shalahula. Qin'a at me'oredet alenu leven ha'umot. You are going to cause animosity between us and the Goyim. We, at this time, of course, the Jewish people, some of whom, but only a relatively small number, were in Eretz Yisrael, having been allowed to return something like perhaps 3 generations earlier to Eretz Yisrael by Koresh. So there were some Jews in Eretz Yisrael. Most Jews were still in Chutz La'aretz, and both the Jews in Chutz La'aretz and in Eretz Yisrael were constantly under threat, or there was definitely tension between the Jews wherever they lived and their non-Jewish neighbors. And in fact, that is the underlying and generally not understood story of Purim, as I will mention a bit later. So you're going to cause trouble, so we should perhaps not do this. That was what the Hachamim said to Esther. Esther replied, Shalahalahem kevar kethuva ani al divrei hayomim lemalchin v'dai ufaras. She said, that's not going to work. Everyone knows about this story. Everyone knows what happened because it is recorded in the royal records and archives of the Persian Empire. What, of course, was the issue? These Hachamim, or some of them, those who responded to her in this vein, felt that the story of Jews rising up as an armed force and fighting and killing and destroying their enemies, this was not good press for the Jews. This would not engender positive relations with other nations, with other ethnic groups. And keep in mind, the Persian Empire was an empire with a myriad ethnic groups within it. It wasn't even a question of a majority Persian nation and a few minorities. It was a very widespread empire with many, many nations and creeds and religions, and therefore also many tensions. There were great tensions between these groups, and the Jews particularly had their own political issues with their neighbors, particularly because of the return of some of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael. And if this sounds familiar to you from more recent history, then you're not mistaken. It's very much reminiscent of what we are familiar with from our own times or from the last few generations. But this is going back nearly 2,500 years. So Esther said to them, this is not a good idea. I'm sorry, they said to her, this is not a good idea. And she said, if you're trying to keep things under wraps and avoid this getting into the press, into the public domain, that's not going to happen. It's already well known and everyone knows it. Everyone's heard about it. And that's a very poor excuse. In other words, in simple terms, she did not accept their response and their claim and their fear. She did not share their fear. The next source, at the end of number 1, Gimel, it says there on the same daf, Shalaha lahem Esther lahachamim. She further wrote to them and said, Kitvuni ledorot, which means, I want these events of Purim to be officially accepted as part of either as part of the canon, that is to say, part of the Tanakh, although that was not it's not entirely clear that is what happened, because we find in the Talmud much later that even Shemuel Bavli did not regard Megillat Esther to be Metamet Yadayim. In other words, he did not regard the Megillah as part of the Tanakh. It's something that you have to read on Purim, but it was not, in his view, part of the Tanakh. It was not one of the Kitvei HaKodesh. At any rate, she said this has to become an official document that the Jews read and has to be written down in a fixed text, fixed nusach, a fixed redaction of these events has to exist in order to perpetuate the memory of these events. And again, what did they reply? Shalahula, we're not really in favor of this. We cannot accept this request of yours or this demand. Halo chatavti lecha, the pasuk says in Mishlei, Shalishim, b'mo'isot wada'av. This pasuk in Mishlei is explained in this drasha as follows: Shalishim v'lo riba'im. This concept of Amalek, of Mihiyat Amalek, which is one of the central themes of Purim, and that is why we just read Parashat Zachor. We read Parashat Zachor Davka before Samuch LePurim, because there is an intrinsic and very significant connection between these two things. This concept of Mihiyat Amalek should be written in 3 places, but we do not find a source, a basis for it to be written in 4 places. Until they noticed that the pasuk in the Torah says in Sefer Shemot, Perek Yud Zayin, the end of Parashat V'Shalach, Kathov Zot Zikaron B'Sefer, and they would doresh this pasuk in the following way: Kathov Zot Mashe Katuv Kan, that which is written here in Sefer Shemot, Uv Mishneh Torah. There we also find in Mishneh Torah we find the end of Parashat Kiteseh, the what we read on Parashat Zachor, Parashat Zachor Hashem Asa Lecha Amalek. Zikaron, the other word in the pasuk here in Shemot, Mashe Katuv B'Nevi'im. This refers to what we find in Sefer with regards to Shaul HaMelech, who was instructed by Shemuel HaNavi to attack Amalek, the capital city of Amalek, Ir Amalek. B'Sefer, Mashe Katuv B'Megillah. So we find there are 3 terms: Kathov, Zoth, Zikaron, and Sefer. And therefore they acquiesced to write, have a Megillah written and accepted by them and given their stamp of approval, that this would be the official record of these events, and it must be written, must be read and heard by all Jews every year. Now, if you look at these 3 statements on the same daf, the same amud in the Gemara, what do you see? You see that the acceptance of this new fangled chag, you could say, this new idea of Purim, which had never existed, was not such a simple matter. It did not happen overnight, and it was not readily accepted by all, including not all the Hachamim by any means were eager to make this into a chag kavua, a fixed event in the Jewish calendar, with religious ramifications and ideological ramifications. It was not something that not everyone warmed to the idea immediately. That is what Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda says, B'Tehillah Kivua B'Shushan. This is where Mordechai and Esther were in charge, because they could send out decrees from the palace. But the rest of the world, rest of the Jewish world, it took time. Then we find that when Esther wrote to the Chachamim, Kiv'oni levaroth, they were very reluctant. And when she said to them, Kiv'oni levaroth, again they were reluctant. It took some doing until this concept and this new chag was accepted. Now the truth is that all of this is hinted at, if not perhaps even explicit, in the Megillah itself. Towards the end of the Megillah, Perek Teth, chapter 9, as you see here in source number 2, we read as follows: Vayichtov Mordechai et hadavarim ha'ela vayishlach safarim al kol hayudim asher b'chol medinot hamelech Ahashverosh hakerovim v'harechokim. Mordechai wrote, again, he was writing with the authority and under the royal seal. So he was writing with the authority of the king. L'kayem alehem, that they should accept upon themselves to do what? L'hiyot osim et yom arba'a asar lachodesh Adar, to keep the 14th day of Adar, ve'et yom hamisha asar bo, and the 15th, b'chol shana v'shana, that they should celebrate and commemorate these events on these 2 days every year. Kayomim asher nahu v'hem hayudim me'oyevehem v'achodesh asher nepach lehem miyavon l'simcha u'me'ever liyom tov. These days, la'asot otam, to celebrate them and commemorate them, yemei mishtah v'simcha, days of celebration and feasting, u'mishloach manot ish le'ra'ehu u'matanot le'evyonim. The send and which mishteh is from the word mishteh we learn the inyan of Seudat Purim and Mishloach Manot and Matanot Le'evyonim. V'chibel ha'Yehudim et asher ha'elu la'asot, and the Jews accepted this as a overriding halachic principle. In other words, not just something that we're doing now because we chose to do it. This is now part of the Torah, part of the halakha. They began to do it as a kind of minhag, as a kind of reshut, but this became now, Mordechai wanted it to become a miswah, a new miswah in the Torah. And this is how it is listed by some of the monem miswot, some of the early hachamim who list the Taryag, the 613 miswot. Purim is and the Megillah are the first example of miswot min divrei soferim from the Chachamim and not from the Torah. And then it goes on to say, "Vatichtov Esther hamalka vat Avihail uMordechai Yehudi et kol tochef." Now it says that not only did Mordechai write, but Esther hamalka, and she was even more senior than Mordechai in terms of her position in the royal household. They wrote kol tokef. Now the word tokef here means that this was a royal decree. The people could not easily refuse. In other words, Esther and Mordechai were using their political clout, their position in the Persian Empire to get the Jews to follow what they were saying. L'chayemet igeret hapurim hazot hasheni. Vayishlach, we'll see what that means in a moment. Vayishlach sefarim el kol hayudim, and therefore this was sent out to all the Jews. El sheva wa esrim u'me'am medina malchut Ahashverosh divrei shalom wa'emet l'chayemet yemei purim ha'ele bizmanehem. So letters were sent out to all the Jews in all the various provinces of the empire to celebrate these days and to keep them every year. Ka'asher qiyam alehem Mordechai Yehudi v'Esther hamalka, as they were instructed and essentially forced by Mordechai and Esther to do. V'ka'asher qiyamu al nafsham wa al zar'am divrei asamot v'za'akotam u'ma'amar Esther. It was the word and the decree of Esther, qiyam divrei purim ha'ele, that made this a reality. V'nichtav b'sefer. Those are the words that we read in the Megillah. What do they mean? What do we have to understand from all of this? Rashi explains as follows: Vayichtov Mordechai. I divided the text here into 2 paragraphs. At the beginning, it spoke about Mordechai, and then it spoke about Esther. Rashi says, "Vayichtov Mordechai hiya Megillah hazot kamot shehi." In other words, Mordechai wrote this Megillah, the Megillah of Esther that we read every year. And then when it speaks about in the second paragraph, that Esther and Mordechai together wrote a second time, L'kayim tigeret hapurim hazot hasheni. Rashi says, Hasheni l'shana hasheniya hazaru v'sharahu sefarim sheyasu purim. What does that tell you? What do you understand from that? Why do they have to write a second time? Clearly, I believe, because there was opposition, and they saw that not all the Jews wanted to do this, and there were Hachamim apparently who opposed this idea. As we saw before, at least some of the Hachamim, my estimation is that at first a majority of the Hachamim were opposed to this whole concept of a new Chag and this celebration of Purim. And therefore they felt they had to send the second year to insist and to emphasize this is not just for this year, this is for all years. That's what Rashi said. Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra writes not something different. In other words, he doesn't say anything that disagrees with Rashi, but I think he's much more specific and much more focused on the true import of these Pesukim that we just read. Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra says, "Vayichtov Mordechai levado." This is the first paragraph that I mentioned above. Lekayem by himself first. Lekayem b'shana ba'ah u'chacha kol hashanim simchat yemei Purim. Initially, Mordechai wrote, and so therefore, Vayichtov Mordechai, it does not refer necessarily, according to the Pirush of Ibn Ezra, does not refer necessarily to the text of the Megillah, but he wrote a decree, he published a decree that the Jews should celebrate Purim. And then in the second paragraph, as we saw, both now Esther joined Mordechai to back him up, to give it more authority, and they wrote a second time, and they wrote Et Kol Tokef. The word Tokef means with all the full force of the law. Et Kol Tokef, the Ibn Ezra writes, Kemo Hozek, v'chamo im yithkefu ha'echad, v'hinei kethava hi w'hu. They wrote together, both of them. And he goes on to say, at the end of, we read at the end of these Pesukim, in the second paragraph, we read that Vayishlach Sefarim, the second line, Vayishlach Sefarim and Kol HaYudim, letters of this decree, copies of this decree were sent out to all the provinces of the Persian Empire. Divrei Shalom Wa'emeth. What does that mean, Divrei Shalom Wa'emeth? Abraham ibn Ezra says, V'ta'am emeth. Why does it say emeth? Shehem hayavim lishmor Purim kasher qiblu al nafsham. Initially, they accepted to do this. It was maybe even intuitive to them that they should celebrate and thank Hashem for what happened, but that it should become a new religious obligation of Miswah for all time, for their children and grandchildren, for all generations of Jews, for all time. This was not obvious to them, as it was to Mordechai and apparently to Esther, but I think Mordechai was the real instigator of this. And the proof that this is the correct understanding, in other words, when it says Divrei Shalom wa emeth, emeth means he told them what they are required to do, and he made it also a royal decree, but he also explained to them why it should be done. Uma'amar Esther, and we read at the end of the second paragraph, the last line, Uma'amar Esther, Qiyam Divrei Purim ha'eleh. What does that mean? That the words of Esther brought it into existence or made it fixed. Right? Ibn Ezra explains, "V'hinei lo nifkayem al yedei Mordechai levado ad shekatava Esther." It did not take hold. It did not gain traction with the Jews, and I think we can also add that with the Hachamim. Initially, it was opposed. And there was probably quite some mahloket about this, as I will explain presently. And initially, Mordechai by himself did not have sufficient authority to enact Purim for all time. But the royal decree, the additional decree of and seal of Esther as queen, this made it happen. This made it what it became, what Purim actually became, as we know it today. It was the act of Esther in the final analysis that made this a reality. That's what the pasuk says according to Ibn Ezra, and I think that's the simple pshat of the Megillah. Now, do we find any hint of such discussions in other sources in Hazal? The answer is most definitely yes. In source number 3, can I assume that everyone is able to see the screen? Number 3? Yes? Everyone with me? Everyone can hear me? Yes?
Yes, I could hear you, and the sources are very clearly visible. If you could zoom in a little bit, I think that would be helpful.
On the screen?
Yeah,
The,
meaning to make the text a little bit larger.
I can try and do that, I think. Just a moment.
You
Someone
can do
just said-
that on you can do that on your screen yourself. Like click on the
Yeah,
mouse
there you
and
go.
like
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Good? Okay, wonderful. Very well. Okay, so the next source, number 3, is from the Talmud Yerushalmi in Masechet Megillah, where it states as follows: Rabbi Yirmiyah b'shem Rabbi Shemuel bar Rav Yitzhak, ma'asu Mordechai wa Esther. What exactly did these two pivotal figures in our history, and certainly with regards to the history of Purim, what did they do exactly? Kafavu Igeret, they wrote a letter, and they sent it to the Hachamim, to our teachers. Sheken omru lahem, mekabalim atem alechem shnei yamim halalu. It should say, I think, halalu, that yud is probably a ta'uf sofer, a mistake. Shnei yamim halalu b'chol shana. They wrote to the Chachamim and said, do you accept this concept, this idea, this decree of ours, that these days become fixed events that all Jews will celebrate every year? Amru lahem, they said to them, no, we're not really in favor of this at all. Lo dayenu hasarot haba'ot alenu. Do we not have enough tzoros? You can just imagine the the Rabbanim pulling their beards and saying this and writing back, responding to Mordechai wa Esther. Don't we have enough trouble? Lo dayenu hasarot haba'ot alenu. Eno shatem rosim lehosif alenu od sarato shel Haman. You want to cause more trouble? You want to give the goyim roundabout more reason to dislike us, to despise us, to plot against us? And we know from Sefer Ezra and Sefer Nehemiah that the goyim roundabout in Eretz Yisrael and around Eretz Yisrael, where the Jews who returned from the Galuth had settled, were very displeased, to put it mildly, with the return of these Jews. They had hoped that they had seen the last of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael, and they, of course, had, in the interim, they had taken over all the fields and the houses and the property. And it's very inconvenient when these Jews who are no longer supposed to be here all of a sudden show up and say, excuse me, this is ours, this is mine, this used to be my great-grandfather's field, or something like that. And again, if you feel that this is in some way reminiscent of more recent events, again, you're not wrong at all. History does indeed repeat itself. Excuse me. So Mordechai and Esther wrote a second time. That is what is referred to in the pasuk. So here again, just as we saw from the psukim themselves in Sefer Esther, in number 2, and as we understood from the Perush of Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, we understand here also in the Talmud Yerushalmi, essentially we have further corroboration of what Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra wrote, that they had to write twice to the Chachamim to insist that they accept this idea. Ma haya kathuv ba? What did they write? Amru lahem, im midavar ze atem mityareim. If you are concerned about the goyim and their hatred towards us, so this will only cause more animosity and friction and hatred towards the Jews. The word archim is like the word archive. In other words, it's already well known. As the Megillah states, it's written in the official archives, and the Megillah records this. V'chol ma'aseh thokpo u'gvuratho, referring to Ahasuerus, u'farashat gedulat Mordechai, and the well-known story of the rise of Mordechai, asher gidelo hamelech, that the Melech, the king Ahasuerus, promoted and made into a central figure in the government. Halohem ketuvim al sefer divrei hayomim lemalchei Mordechai u'faras. You cannot hide these things. Everyone knows it. So here too, in as we understood from the Talmud Bavli before, we see here the same record, the same story being reported here in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and therefore we find that it continues, and it says, Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachman b'shem Rabbi Yonathan. שמונים וחמישה זקנים ומהם 35 נביאים. A group, a Beth Din, a Sanhedrin of 85 Hachamim, and amongst them over 30 who were on the level of having Ruach HaKodesh. They're referred to here as Nevi'im. היו מסתערים על הדבר הזה. What do you mean they were מסתערים? They were very unhappy with this idea. What a particular idea. It's very clear. It says precisely, Amru, Kathiv, Eleham Miswot. It says in the Pasuk, these are the Miswot, Asher Siwa Adonai et Moshe, al Bnei Israel. The Miswot we know, they're in the Torah, and those are the Miswot that as Jews we are required to observe. Bahar Sinai. Elu HaMiswot, Shenistawenu Mipi Moshe. These are the Miswot we were taught and told and commanded to do by Moshe. Kach Amar Lanu, this is what he told us. This is our tradition. We've always known that this is how the Torah works. Moshe said, En Navi Aher Afiv Lahadesh Lachem Davar Me'ata. There will not be another Navi in the future who will add to the Torah or change the Torah that I'm giving you. This Torah is for all time. And you, Mordechai and Esther, Mevakshim Lahadesh Lanu Davar, and you suggest a new Miswah be added to the Torah, to Yahadut. What are you? Reform Jews? You're trying to change this essential tenet of Torah Judaism. This, of course, is exactly what we saw before, earlier in source number 1 from the Talmud Bavli, when there in the Talmud Bavli, the formulation of these discussions and these letters backwards and forwards is slightly different, but the import is the same. When Esther said to them in 1 Gimel, Kitvuni ledoroth, make it so that this becomes an official document that the Jews will read. The Megillah will be something that Jews will know and will read every year. It says that they were not immediately for this idea at all, until they were able to find this pasuk, Kathov Zod Zikaron B'Sefer, as we explained before. Here we see the same thing, and even more plainly expressed in the Talmud Yerushalmi. They said, you can't just come along and add something to the Torah like that. That's not the Torah that we know, that we have learned and taught. So you want to Mahadesh? That's not how we do things. Nevertheless, the Yerushalmi continues, Lo zazu misham, noseim v'nofanim b'davar, ad she'ha'ir HaKodesh Baruch Hu et eineihem. In other words, nevertheless, they were unable to drop the matter, and I will add here, they were unable to drop it because Mordechai and Esther particularly did not allow them to drop it. They forced them to discuss and consider the matter until eventually they would agree. And until Hashem opened their eyes, and they found Pesukim in the Tanakh, in the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim to back up this idea of a new event and a new text in the Jewish world connected to Amalek. Again, the same pasuk that the Talmud Bavli mentioned Zoth Torah kamod thema uzoth, as it says in the pasuk, "Uzoth haTorah she'osa Moshe lifnei bnei Yisrael." Zikaron, that is also a term that appears there in the pasuk at the end of Sefer B'Shalach, when after the initial war with Amalek. Elu haneviim, as it says, "Az nidbaru yirei Adonai ish el ra'ehu v'yakshev Adonai v'yishma' v'yikatev sefer zikaron lefano liyirei Adonai u'lehoshev shemo." So it talks about Sefer Zikaron. This is in the Nevi'im. B'Sefer, it says in the pasuk there in B'Shalach, Ketov Zod Zikaron B'Sefer Elu HaKetuvim. In other words, we can learn from here that there should also be a text in the Ketuvim, in the third section of the Tanakh, and according to this Darasha, it is the Megillah is part of the Tanakh. U'ma'amar Esther Qiyam Divrei Purim Ha'ela V'nichtav B'Sefer. In other words, again, we see that the Hachamim, or at least some of them, probably, I think many of them, probably a majority of them initially, were very reluctant to accept this idea of establishing a new Hag, a new festival, and a new Sefer, a new Megillah that should be read by the Jews and something that should be celebrated every year. This was not something which immediately found favor with them, and it took some time. And I imagine there was a discussion and a mahloket amongst various Chachamim. Mordechai was probably the leader of one camp, one Beth Midrash amongst the Chachamim, and there were others who thought that Mordechai was too much of a hadshan, too much of an original thinker, someone who was willing to do and say things that others before him had not done and said. And therefore, it was discussed, and probably discussed for a long time. It doesn't say here how long it took for all these discussions and the eventual consensus that eventuated. It doesn't say here how long all this process took. My guess would be that it was a matter of some generations even. We, of course, are living so long and so far removed from these events that it's impossible for us to imagine that there would have been a mahloket whether you should celebrate Purim this year on Yudal B'Iyar, or Ba'adar, or Tethwal Ba'adar, or not. But I think at that time, from what we see here, this was definitely a very real discussion, a very real mahloket between various hashkafot, various points of view. Different Rabbanim and Gedolim did not agree about this, but Mordechai and Esther had a very definite view, and they had the upper hand because they were also able to apply pressure as agents of the palace of the Persian emperor. And this is what we see, I believe. The fact that there was such a mahloket, and not everyone was happy with Mordechai and his suggestions and his ideas, which we know today as the miswah of Kiryat Megillah, of reading the Megillah, and what we know today as celebrating Purim. Not all the Hachamim were really with this program at all. And this is what we find, I believe, in the Talmud Bavli, Megillah Daf Tet Zayin, source number 4. It says, Ki Mordechai HaYehudi Mishneh LaMelech HaHashverosh, V'gadol LaYudim, V'rasui L'rov Ehau. Now the simple pshat of this term, V'rasui L'rov Ehau, in other words, Peshuto Shel Mikra is the vast, huge number. In other words, Rov is like Ribui Ehau. In other words, it doesn't mean a majority as opposed to a minority who also existed who were less happy with Mordechai. That's not the pshat. The pshat is to all of the Jews in all their huge numbers, they were all for and with Mordechai. But we know that in Lashon Torah Lahod and Lashon Hachamim Lahod, the language of the Torah and the Tanakh is not always synonymous and identical with the language of Hazal. In Hazal, the term Rov means majority, as it does in modern Hebrew today as well, where you talk about a mahloket, Rov Posekim say this and Miut Posekim say this. We're talking about a majority and a minority. Rav Ehau, v'lo chol Ehau. That is a drasha here in the Talmud Bavli Daf Ted Zayin, that he was liked and he was followed by most of his brethren, most of the Jews, but not all of them. What does the Gemara say based on this? Melamed, from here we learn, sheperashu mimenu miksat Sanhedrin, that some of the Hachamim literally separated themselves or broke away from him. They had a rift with him. There was a rift. There was a mahloket, a very serious mahloket. In other words, what we're hearing here are the echoes from almost 2,500 years ago, a bit less, maybe 2,470 years ago or something like that. We are hearing here the distant echoes of a very major discussion and mahloket in the Jewish world amongst the Hachamim, and one imagines also amongst the Jews themselves, because some Jews obviously would have followed this group of Chachamim and others follow the other group of Chachamim. And just as we know today, Jews have plenty to argue about. We all know that Jews are an argumentative people, and machlokes is not a new thing, and it existed in those times as well. And here, there was a machloket about Mordechai, his ideas, his suggestion, his approach that in Yahadut there is room for certain changes and hidushim. Everything, of course, according to the Torah, according to the spirit of the Torah, and even according to the letter of the Torah, as we saw. All these things were eventually given a seal of approval based on a drasha of various pesukim. But there was also this reality for a time, at least in his day, in his lifetime, according to this statement in the Talmud Bavli, that not everyone agreed and accepted Mordechai's position and his hashkafa, his Torah outlook. And Rashi explains here, sheperashu mimenu. Rashi's explanation is La'niyuth da'ati is not the pshat of what the memorah, this statement of the Talmud comes to tell us. The pshat, I think, is what I just explained. Rashi says, Perashu mimenu, they were unhappy with him and displeased with him. Lefishe batal midivrei Torah v'nichnas lisrara, because he spent less time studying Torah and was involved in, if you want to call it politics or how should we put it? Was involved with the government and matters of state, affairs of state. One of the proofs I think that one can bring for my understanding of that statement of the Talmud Bavli, which is not exactly what Rashi explained now, even though in the words of Rashi you can also find a hint of what I'm saying, because Rashi says that the perisha, the displeasure of some of the Chachamim with Mordechai, had to do with the fact that batami divrei Torah. In other words, it has to do with something to do with Mordechai and the Torah, shall we say. What I suggested was that because of his demands and his halachic approach, his approach to the Torah, and the fact that this is something that can and must be done, and this was not accepted or considered correct by all, that was, I think, what the machloket was about. One of the reasons I think one can further proof for this understanding is what we find in another statement in the Talmud Bavli, but this time in Masechet Sanhedrin, Daf Kov Zayin. There we find a similar statement about when the Sanhedrin is displeased with someone because they think his behavior or his attitude or his actions are incorrect. This is explained, or this is stated in the Talmud in these terms, that the Sanhedrin was poresh mimenu. Where do we see this? With regards to David HaMelech. When David HaMelech sinned, Amar Rav Yehuda Marav, Shisha Hodashim nistara David, v'nistaleka himenu Shechina, u'fereshu mimenu Sanhedrin. There is certainly referring to the fact that the Sanhedrin were expressing their displeasure with David HaMelech's behavior. And we have other statements in Chazal which indicate that it was not a simple matter for many people to accept the fact that David HaMelech had sinned and had also done teshuvah, and he was constantly reminded of his behavior. We see, at least from here, that the term lifrosh, when the Sanhedrin is poresh, when it turns away from someone, when it doesn't want to have anything to do with him, this is an expression of displeasure because of a person's actions and or ideas. In this case, in the case of Mordechai, I think it's because of his ideas and also his actions in terms of demanding that this hug be instituted. So to sum up what we've seen, we see here that Mordechai and Esther, as is written Mefurash, I think in the Megillah, and was as explained Mefurash by Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, and this last line here on the first page of these sources, Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra wrote, "V'hineh lo nitkayem al yad Mordechai levado." Purim would not have happened, would not have become what it did become by the actions and by the direction of Mordechai alone. Ad shekatava Esther, it was Esther's royal seal of approval and her insistence also that eventually carried the day. And as I suggested before, it took some time. I'm quite, I think it's quite reasonable to assume that this discussion did not take place over the period of a week or a month or even a year, but rather many, many years, in fact, until it became accepted by all that this is the correct and proper approach and halachic stance, and eventually was accepted by all the Chachamim and all the Jews. So in the background and between the lines, and actually within the words themselves of the Megillah, we hear that there was in fact very real debate and even probably rancorous debate and discussion and accusations and mahloket between different factions within the Jewish people as to how to go about approaching this Torah concept, this idea of introducing a new hag and formulating a new chovah, a new obligation for Jews to read the Megillah every year and to celebrate in a certain way every year. It's not the case that such things are accepted without debate in the Jewish people, because by and large the Torah is based on Masoret, on tradition, and we do this year what we did last year and the year before that, and we are always wary of Hidushim and Hadshanim. But it is also a fact that sometimes Hidushim and Hadshanim are necessary to respond in the correct way to a new reality, to a new situation. And if all of this reminds you again of some of the things that go on in the Jewish world today, again, I don't think that you would be mistaken in seeing this parallel. I mentioned at the beginning, and I will end with this thought, that Mordechai there was a connection between the return of some of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael sometime before these events of Purim, and Mordechai and his presence in the Persian court, because even before he was promoted to this very high position and he replaced Haman, even before this we see that Mordechai was present, he was around, he was in the palace courtyard, he was involved, he wasn't a stranger to the Persian court and to the machinations and workings of the empire. So what was Mordechai doing there? What was his job? Why was he there in the first place? I think another largely overlooked and misunderstood aspect of Purim is the fact that the return of Am Yisrael to Eretz Yisrael, the return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland at that time, or a couple of generations before, 3 generations before that time, was a very hot topic in the Persian Empire. We know this for a fact from Sefer Ezra and Nehemiah, where we see that, as I mentioned before, the Goyim roundabout were very upset and displeased, to put it mildly, with the return of these pesky Jews who were getting in the way and wanted to rebuild the wall of the Homa, the wall around Yerushalayim, and they were rebuilding the Mikdash, which is of course what they had been allowed to do. But eventually Koresh died, another king came along, and another decree was issued preventing them from continuing this work. There was a lot of political machination and intrigue connected with the return of the Jewish people to Eretz Yisrael, just as things are today. Exactly the same reality as it was 100 years ago, and as it was 30 years ago, and as it is today, and as it will be in a year or 30 years from now as well. Because the Jewish people always have enemies, particularly when it comes to the Jewish people returning to where they belong, which is not necessarily what certain other groups and peoples and nations really have in mind. It's not in their interests, shall we say. And the Persian Empire, which was the reigning power, within that Persian Empire, within the court, there were different factions. Haman, in my view, was the head of that faction, which wanted to prevent the Jews really putting down roots and re-establishing themselves in Eretz Yisrael. He's referred to as Haman ha'al-Ghari, descendant of the Amalekim. But all of the enemies of the Jewish people formed a faction. You don't have to be an Amaleki necessarily in the biological sense to not want the Jews to return to their villages and towns in Eretz Yisrael and to re-establish themselves. As we read again in the Tanakh, in Ezra and Nehemiah, there were the Shomronim and the Kuthim and various nations and groups and tribes that had invaded and overtaken parts of the country. And they had their representatives in their Shtadlanim. They had their they had their lobbyists in the Persian court, just as today there's a Jewish lobby in the United States, in the American political machine, and there are pro-Arab, pro-Iranian, pro all kinds of lobbyists and lobbies and interests, and there's lots of money involved and lots of intrigue and goings on backwards and forwards. Exactly the same thing was happening in those times. Mordechai was the representative, was the lobbyist for the Jews, and Haman was the lobbyist for the enemies of the Jews, and that is why they couldn't stand each other. And Haman also, on top of all of this, decided that if possible, he would also put an end to this entire debate, as it were, with these Jews who are a tremendous nuisance and causing trouble and working against his interests and the interests of his people and his allies by simply wiping them out. And that essentially is the story of Purim. So I hope that with this information, Purim before you, this year Purim will perhaps take on a different aspect from what it was perhaps in the minds of many people until having perhaps heard this shiur, these sources, and having understood them as we have explained them today. Kol tuv lachem. I wish you all the best. Purim sameach, and hizku v'yames levavchem kol hamehalim l'Adonai.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Hayim.
Shalom, shalom.
A Shushan Purim Sameach to you.
Kol tov. Shalom. Although I no longer live in Yerushalayim, so I do not celebrate.
Oh, you'll be celebrating the same day as us.
Same day as you, correct. Kol tov.
Kol tov.
I cannot end the session, but someone else has to.
Okay, I think Achihud is trying to arrange if there are any questions.
Yeah, do you want to take questions, Rabbi?
I'll take a couple of questions if there are.
Okay. Daniel has one.
Shalom, Rav. I sent this question in the chat, but I can just ask it on here. My question was, to which extent the story of Purim should be taken literally and historically, as opposed to, for example, something that occurred in the spiritual realm or may be interpreted as allegory.
First of all, explain why you or someone else might imagine that such a Megillah written in such detail, why would someone imagine that this is an allegory rather than referring to real events?
We had a class given, and there was an example given of this. I know what he's talking about.
Go on. Go on.
Well, for example, Adam and Chava in Sefer Bereshit, some say that they interacted literally with a nachash, and some say that their interaction didn't occur physically in the material realm, but in the spiritual one. And their story is also written in great detail, both in the Torah Shebichtav, and it is also referenced in the Torah Shebal Peh. So inferring from that, I'm not really sure what to make of Megillat Esther as a text.
I personally do not see any possible room for comparison between what we find in Sefer Bereshit with regards to Adam and Hawa, which is written in an ahistorical context. It's not doesn't relate to any historical events to which we can refer with which we are familiar. And yes, there is definitely room, as some of our great rabbis and sages have pointed out. There is room to understand that, perhaps in an allegorical sense, and there is reason to do so. I would also point out that it's not nearly the same amount of detail. You're talking there about something that's related in a few tens, perhaps, of Pesukim at the most, whereas in the Megillat Esther, you're talking about 9 chapters. You're talking about hundreds of Pesukim. Megillat Esther describes, in my view, very real historical events. I know that there are people of different stripes and different types who have suggested otherwise. I'm familiar with this claim, but I do not see any basis or reason to entertain such thoughts. We know there was a Persian Empire. We know that the Jews were permitted by Koresh, approximately, assuming that we know when Ahasuerus reigned, and I think we do, roughly the mid 5th century Leminyana, according to their Goyish calculations. So approximately 3 generations before that time, Koresh permitted the Jews to return to Yerushalayim, to Eretz Yisrael, to rebuild the Mikdash. This is related, these events are also related to the Tanakh, that it actually took place. The Jews, some Jews, not maybe as many as should have, but some Jews returned in the original return, and later with Ezra, and later with Nehemiah. That was the beginning of that was the seed that eventually blossomed into the period of the Beit Sheni, the Second Temple period, when the Jews became very numerous indeed in Eretz Yisrael. Initially, there were only a few tens of thousands of Jews, as recorded in Sefer Ezra. We know all this is very real. We know when Ahasuerus lived, give or take. There is discussion about that as well, but I think it's fairly clear when he lived. There was such a king. We know which king this was. We know that there was great rivalry and and dislike and downright hatred and even attempts to physically attack the Jews who were rebuilding the walls of Yerushalayim, as described in Sefer Nehemiah. We know all of this to be true. Nehemiah is roughly around the same time as Mordechai. And I think if you just read the Megillah with your eyes wide open, and you with all these facts that we've mentioned in the background, I think it becomes very obvious that Mordechai was a lobbyist for the Jewish cause, and Haman was part of the anti-Jewish faction, and he rose to a very high position, and he immediately tried to misuse his power to destroy the Jews and destroy their political aspirations as well, because he was an Arari, he was a descendant of ancient enemies of the Jewish people. And if you wish to claim that he wasn't actually a descendant of these ancient enemies, these Amalekim of the Jewish people, well, then that only goes to, that only forces one to draw an additional and even more far-reaching conclusion. And this is a statement that Rabbeinu Hagaon, Rabbi Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik Zetzal writes in the book Ish HaEmunah, the man of faith, the name of his father, Hagaon Rabbi Moshe Soloveitchik, that Amalek is not a biological reality. It does not refer to a particular racial group, but rather any staunch, bitter, and determined enemy of the Jewish people who make it their business to destroy the Jews, who make it plain, who state in their own words that we wish to kill the Jews and destroy them and not allow them to have their country, their sovereign country in their homeland. We wish to drive them into the sea, etc., etc. Any such people are to be seen as having the halachic definition. This is not a drasha that Rav Soloveitchik was stating. Rav Soloveitchik was not a person who made drashas. He didn't give over voting. Rav Soloveitchik was an Ish Halacha, another one of his books by that very name, Ish Halacha, Ish Emunah. He thought in halachic terms. He was an Ish Halacha. He was a Gaon Atzum, and a very profound Gaon, and he saw and explained this concept of Amalek as referring to any group of Oivim Muvhakim of the Jewish people in all generations. And he explicitly says that at that time, when he made this, when he gave this speech in which he said that he gave this shiur, when he mentioned these ideas. This was in 1956, the time of the Suez Crisis. And he says in earlier years, in the 30s and the 40s, it was the Nazis and the Germans and their associates. And today, he said, it's Nasser and the Mufti and their associates. Wa'idach zil gemor, hamevin yavin. There is no need to belabor the point. The halachic truth of this statement, I think, is overwhelming when it is understood and perceived correctly with an open mind and an open heart.
Okay, thank you, Rob.
All right. Kol tov to you all. Shalom, shalom.
Thank you, Rabbi.